one of the challenges with working with guys all over the world is there's a lot more units than people realize that people will use in Europe. The estrogen number doesn't perfectly correlate with estrogenic symptoms, but it does to a degree. So I think it is worth checking it. We don't know a single thing that this thing is going to do in the short term, long term in men, outside of the fact that it plumps up your balls.
So, but then at this point, you're just like, do you measure estrogen, estradiol, E1, E2? Or you're like, you know what? Don't worry about it unless you have symptoms, or what's kind of your take?
I was very heavily influenced by Chris Kresser. Chris Kresser, his book Unconventional Medicine, when I read it, it made a huge amount of sense to me, which kind of birthed this concept of being a health coach. And he had this saying, which is, test, not guess. And that has been a really important thing for me. I mean, in Australia, the panels that we use, it's testosterone, SHBG, free testosterone, estradiol. So I've seen just as many estradiol tests as I have testosterone tests, just by default. I mean, I do work with a small amount of guys in the US, but I always test it. I like to have more information. I like to have more data. And I think the idea that just because we're not going to use an aromatase inhibitor, it doesn't mean that the estrogen number shouldn't be checked. So I just like to check it. I mean, if we can check it, I'm going to check it. So I've seen a lot of estrogen numbers over the years. I wish everyone in the world used the same units so that it would be an easier conversation to have. Yeah. One of the challenges with working with guys all over the world is there's a lot more units than people realize that people will use in Europe. So Europe is a mess. But I'm going to talk about the reference range a lot today because we can just, talk about relative to where the reference range is. And what I have found as a ballpark, there's kind of, room up and down. But if your testosterone level is elevated X% above the reference range, your estradiol is probably going to be elevated about X% above the reference range as well, give or take. Yeah. So if someone, like when we get guys who come in who are like morbidly obese, drinking a bunch of alcohol, they're pre-diabetic, they're not taking anything to control insulin, they will have testosterone levels at the bottom of the reference range and estrogen at double the top of the range. That's a problemo. But what I have found is that the estrogen number doesn't perfectly correlate with estrogenic symptoms, but it does to a degree. So I think it is worth checking it. The counter argument is that, well, estrogen is a paracrine hormone, so the level that we're getting in the serum is not accurate. But even Dr. John Crisling, rest in peace, he used to say that the serum estradiol is a proxy. So it's not to be taken completely literally, like black letter number, but it's still a mark in the sand. So I like to measure it from that approach. But we also can't measure the activity of the androgen and estrogen receptors in the body. I think that's not ideal, but it doesn't mean that the serum estradiol number is completely redundant. It just means that it should be taken with a grain of salt, but I don't like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't think that's a good idea. So I always measure it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I kind of do the same thing. In the old days, I was able to hold the labs away. Like let's say I have a guy and he comes in and I'll talk total. I know free is more important, but people know total. I like talking about total just because the numbers are easier, right? So, and to make the math easy, let's say he has a 500 milligram per deciliter total, 25 picograms per milliliter estradiol, right? And I'll tell him, I'm like, look, man, if we're going to get you up to 1,000, I'm not going to be surprised if your estradiol goes from 25 to 50. So just so you know, next time we measure your stuff, and I want to ask them symptoms first. Do you have any symptoms? And usually gynecomastia is going to be the only, my opinion, kind of really tail sign. Moodiness. My joke is like, you see a dead bunny on the side of the road and you start crying, or you put on that old George Strait song, you start crying. Like, okay, there's something up with your mood. Whether it's your estrogen or not, we need to figure it out.
If you've just started TRT, it is completely normal to feel overwhelmed and confused. There's a lot of new territory to cover, and there is a lot of conflicting information. I wrote TRT 101 so that you can have everything that you need to know in an instruction manual in one place that you can refer back to, that you can have all the questions answered before they even come up. TRT 101 is my best practice approach for TRT from start to finish, and it contains everything that you need to avoid all the challenges and pitfalls that I've seen come up in my clients over the last 5 years. You can check it out via the link below.
So I've always kind of, and it was funny, after doing this hundreds of times, I just looked at it. Okay, this is probably what's going to happen. And then some guys get symptoms and some don't. I have some guys, I can be at 70 to 80, no issues at all. I'm fine. No nipple sensitivity. And I don't want to mess with it. Kind of like you're saying, when I start guys on TRT, I like doing just testosterone. I don't want to use anything else. Even supplements, honestly, a lot of times, DHEA, even pregnenolone. TRT, do this for 6 to 8 weeks. Then we can decide on pulling another lever. Because if we pull another lever, you come back and you tell me X, Y, and Z. And I think that's one of the big things when you want to talk about gyno. It was probably you're throwing a guy on 200 mg of test a week. You're putting him on ACG, which I do think causes gyno. And then you throw him on an estradiol. No wonder the guy's all wonky and weird and you don't know what's causing what. So I still measure the estradiol, but I really do it just because I have to monitor the symptoms and then figure out, okay, you're feeling better, you're feeling worse. And I tell them, I don't want to mess with it. I don't want to, your testosterone aromatase on its own. Unless you have symptoms, why would I pull another lever? Especially when these things do, if anyone, go and check out some of those videos that Dave had recommended, like you need estrogen, right? Growth hormone, bones, blood, all that stuff. So, but I get it. That's just baggage, right? And then we have to unpack it. That's half of my visits is unpacking these old ideas. So then what do you think about ACG in accordance with, I personally, I think kind of the idea, you're taking ACG, if it's hitting the Leydig cells, which I know you did a video, I'm excited to ask you about mechanism of action. I think if it's endogenously produced, I do think you get more aromatization. You do get more 5-alpha reductase activation. Because I've seen like a guy on ACG versus a guy on testosterone, way more side effects on ACG, right? Gyno, acne, sexually way more sensitive, moods all over the place. So what's kind of your opinion of ACG? Do you use it at all? Do you think it's worth in the fertility or?
HCG is a really interesting topic, and I think that, or I would like to think that we're going to learn more about HCG in men in the coming years if someone wants to fund some more research into it. I don't know if they will, but I'm not particularly optimistic with it. So there's a lot of misconceptions about HCG, and I think the term that gets parroted a lot is that HCG is a mimetic of luteinizing hormone. And mimic means to do the same. So if something agonizes the same receptor but produces a different physiological response, it's not a mimetic. It's an agonist. So an example I often use is that LSD, like acid, the psychedelic, produces the psychedelic effect via the serotonin receptor. So that's like saying that acid is a mimetic of an SSRI. No, it's not. If you take one or the other, you're going to have a very different day. So this term is a massive misconception. And if HCG was a mimetic of luteinizing hormone, it wouldn't cause side effects. So HCG is fundamentally different from luteinizing hormone. And if it wasn't, then I mean the real question is, why would a pregnant woman make HCG if it does the same thing as luteinizing hormone? They just make more luteinizing hormone. So for the guys listening who don't know, HCG is extracted from a pregnant woman's urine. And then you might be sitting there being like, well, why on earth would I want to inject that into my body on TRT? And I'd be asking the same question. So the idea with HCG is that if you take HCG, because it stimulates the Leydig cells in the testicles, you can keep your testicles active. And I don't think anyone other than cyclists want the small testicles that come with TRT. It's not ideal. I mean, it's not a deal breaker, but I don't think anyone wants small enough.
It's not fun.
It's not fun. It's not ideal, but it's also not a deal breaker. So we have this really tricky scenario, and this is what I talk about in the Beyond TRT lecture, and this is my objective standpoint, which is that, is it better to go on TRT without HCG and leave not just the Leydig cells in the testes, but all throughout the central nervous system and the brain, leaving them dormant, which is not ideal? Or is it better to activate them with something that is not supposed to be in the male body. It's also not supposed to be in the female body long term. And we don't know a single thing that this thing is going to do in the short term, long term in men, outside of the fact that it plumps up your balls. So this is a interesting kind of which one of these is better. And I'm a little bit conservative in a lot of things. And I think that it's best to go with the one that's been studied, because every TRT study that's been done has been done without the concurrent use of HCG. So if there's this myth that if you don't use HCG, you're going to create this deficiency of all these upstream hormones, which really just doesn't occur in practice. But if that were true, then we'd be going, okay, this is a problem, but we don't see all those problems occur in all the literature on TRT without HCG. So I think there's a lot of myths here, but most importantly, if you give 100 guys on TRT HCG, about 50, 60 of them are going to feel absolutely rotten. And that's the part that I think is really important, is that guys don't feel well when they inject a female pregnancy hormone. And a lot of the time it makes them, it has a feminizing effect. And I'm sitting here being like, well, I don't need a study to tell me why that's happening. That's just kind of common sense. So I think that HCG, people like to talk about being like, well, the reason why HCG is feminizing is because it increases intratesticular aromatization, which you can't block with an AI. And people have all these different theories, which I think is very
I've not heard that one. You can't block it because
that was the dominant theory in the forums years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of crap that people talk about, but
okay.
I think that HCG is just inherently psychotropic. I think it's both a psychoactive and psychotropic compound. I think that it crosses the blood-brain barrier and has a psychological a impact that you can subjectively feel. And I think that some guys are more susceptible or more sensitive to that. And I think that it's, when I look at it, my concern, and I don't want to create fear or anxiety in guys who are taking it, but what could this potentially cause cancer in men long term if they take it for the rest of their lives? We don't know. And that's the thing that scares me.
You have to understand is that testosterone does not by default make you a masculine man. It facilitates you becoming that man, but it will not do that work for you. How does testosterone impact how you feel, and how are those mechanisms occurring in the brain?